Hello, everyone. I'd like to warmly welcome everyone to the third annual Dr. Malcolm Peat Lectureship in Community-Based Rehabilitation. To begin with, let us acknowledge that Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We're grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. I know that many of you are joining us from outside Kingston today, and I'd encourage you all to reflect upon and give thanks for the land that you're on today. My name is Heather Aldersey, and I'm the Scientific Director of the International Center for the Advancement of Community-Based Rehabilitation, or the ICACBR. And the ICACBR was created in 1991 by Dr. Malcolm Peat. Malcolm devoted his life to promoting and implementing community-based rehabilitation and other disability and rehabilitation initiatives around the world, right up until he passed away in 2017. He was a tremendous teacher and a mentor, and he opened up so many doors for so many people. His legacy lives on in many ways. Malcolm's friends and family established the Dr. Malcolm Peat Lectureship as one way to honor his legacy, and we're happy to offer the third annual lectureship today. I'd like to thank all the donors of the Peat Lectureship Fund for making this event possible today, and give a particularly warm welcome to all of Malcolm's friends and family who are in the audience. I know that you can't see who the other attendees are, but I would welcome you to write in the chat who you are and where you're coming from. I think that'd be a great way to get connected with the community that's gathered here today. I wanted to thank Dr. Jane Philpott, the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, and Dr. Marcia Finlayson, the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, and the Director of the School of Rehabilitation Therapy for joining us in the audience today. I'd like to particularly recognize and welcome Gail Woodbury, Malcolm's longtime partner, and Fiona Valliere, Malcolm's daughter, who are both with us as well. At this point, I'd like to welcome Fiona to make a few remarks before we get started with the lecture.
Thank you, Heather. I'm Fiona Valliere, Dr. Peat's daughter, and I'm once again pleased and so honored to be attending this year's lecture. I'd like to thank Dr. Aldersey, Dr. Finlayson, and the considerable support team that you have behind you for your creativity in taking advantage of the virtual environment for this lecture. The situation imposed on us has the very positive result of being able to reach a much wider and larger audience. I'm very impressed by the range and scope of the attendance we have this year. It's phenomenal. It's brought us the great fortune of being able to have Professor Ghai engaging with us, which may not have been so simple to accomplish in person. Professor Ghai shares the same vision that Malcolm did, that of societies where all persons with disabilities experience fully equal opportunities. She's an agent of change, believing, as Malcolm did, in that if you can make a difference, why wouldn't you? Thank you, Professor Ghai, for being here today. Malcolm would be honored. And back to you, Heather.
Thanks very much, Fiona. It truly is a silver lining of the unfortunate situation of COVID-19 that we were able to open up the lectureship this year to participants from all over the world. And we truly do have attendance from all over the world today. To give an overview of what the lecture will look like, Professor Ghai will speak to us for approximately 30 minutes, after which time we'll have about 15 minutes for a Q&A period. So please feel free to type all the questions that you might have into the Q&A box throughout the lecture, and I'll bring them to Professor Ghai's attention when she's finished speaking. I also did want to note that the lecture today is being recorded and will be shared with those who are unable to join us for the live event today. So without further ado, it's my great honor to introduce Professor Anita Ghai. Professor Ghai has been a professor at the School of Human Studies, Ambedkar University Delhi since 2015. And before this, Professor Ghai was an associate professor in the Department of Psychology in Jesus and Mary College, University of Delhi. Her research focuses in disability studies with a keen interest in sexuality, care, and gender. Her major publications are Rethinking Disability in India, and Disembodied Form, Issues of Disabled Women. She's also an editor for Disability in South Asia, Knowledge and Experience, and for Disability and Society Journal, the Scandinavian Journal of Disability Research, and the Indian Journal of Gender Studies. Professor Ghai will be speaking with us today about CBR and a critical disability studies approach. Welcome, Professor Ghai.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm really honored and privileged to be a part of Queen's University, where, of course, Malcolm and Dr. Peat, I would consider him as an advocate and a fellow, traveler on this field where, we were thinking about disability and rehabilitation. And I think that is somewhere I feel that if I can say something constructive, I mean, it'll be like a tribute to him, in that particular sense. So I want to say thank you to the family and to each one of you who has taken time out. I hope I can share some of my thoughts with you. And of course, we can then discuss the questions later on. Thank you so much to everyone. And I'm really feeling almost, as if we are, the distance is not there at all, and we are together, and discussing, the issues of disability and, of course, rehabilitation. So let me begin with that, and then I think we can kind of, if there's anything anywhere we can kind of, stop, you can. Okay, so this is the third lecture, Malcolm Peat's lecture by, I have to, sorry. Okay, so we begin with, I'm really honored and privileged to deliver a lecture on community-based rehabilitation and the critical disability studies approach. I speak from an epistemic location of a woman with visible mobility impairment, and as a wheelchair user. Not only that, but I've had love affairs with the doctors, including, two open heart surgeries and cancer, breast cancer. But all these, somewhere, both as an academician and advocate, I actually want to share my thoughts about, community-based rehabilitation and some concerns that I have. To begin with, of course, community-based rehabilitation is a strategy within general community development for the rehabilitation, equalization of opportunities, and social inclusion of all people with disabilities. CBR is implemented through the combined efforts of people with disabilities themselves, their families, organizations, and communities, as well as the relevant governmental and non-governmental health, education, vocational, social, and other services. CBR, in that particular sense, promotes collaboration among community leaders, people with disabilities, and once again, to provide equal opportunities for all people with disabilities in the community. Now, the a majority of people with disabilities who live, especially in global south, in developing countries, predominantly, do not receive any formal disability or rehabilitation services. In these countries or regions where at least some disability services are provided, the community-based rehabilitation approach or some form of it is likely to be the only approach available. Especially when I mentioned the rural area where disability, is actually not really, people can't reach, and some of them can't even come out of their houses. So in that particular sense, I think CBR is the only approach that it works. Of course, you must be familiar with the CBR matrix, and the 5 domains that are there are health, education, livelihood, social, and empowerment. And the CBR matrix provides a framework to understand the different activities of CBR programs in a systemic manner. I've had an opportunity to be a part of CBR in India, specifically in South India. I will share some of the papers which I can share with you all later. However, today I will problematize CBR in some ways. It's a picture which is in Bangalore, and a village called Mandya, where we started doing the community-based rehabilitation. And of course, it is always very, very important that they can reach each person who's there in the rural area. And I think CBR has been famous, in the sense in my country, that this is the only way in which they can reach them. Now, as I was reading Dr. Peat's papers, I was really impressed by Dr. Peat's vision, in which he could sense the medical gaze of CBR. And I was really impressed by that, because within India we thought drawing on the medical model all the time has been a problem, because it's almost as if cure is the only way that you want to be, and you don't want to you only think that through medicine we can be cured, and that's the only significance which is there for people with disabilities. But once again, within India, another thought which came was on the social model of disability, in which persons with disabilities themselves play a decisive role. As you all know, the slogan that nothing for us without us has been very, very critical in social model, and its roots go back to, of course, the participatory research approaches, such as participatory rural appraisal, that allow poor and marginalized persons. And of course, a social model therefore has been acknowledged in CBR and is used very, very extensively. Now, there are 2 or 3 issues which are very, very significant for me. And because I thought there was resonance there in, Dr. Peat's writings. And one particular understanding which I saw in his writing was that of which he spoke about the caregivers, and how women, who are particularly, care for the disabled people, and these women are often the unpaid workers. We've never thought about that. So for me, I think to bring in CBR and women with disabilities, I want to problematize this particular part little more by saying that women with disabilities generally have less access to rehabilitation services than disabled men. Most rehabilitation personnel, including community-based rehabilitation workers in developing countries, are men. Thus, even home-based services provided by male CBR workers are out of the reach for women with disabilities, because there is, patriarchy out there, and it's almost as if women are not allowed too many things which are there. Even if a traditional community accepts males as service providers in healthcare and rehabilitation to some extent, it still would be impossible for them to provide service to or teach the women in the community. And such a situation can be improved if local women are to be trained as rehabilitation workers. While women, rehabilitation workers are becoming common in the subcontinent, the cultural barriers continue to persist, preventing women from taking up rehabilitation work. Like I said, Dr. Peat has discussed the role of women as caretakers, unpaid caretakers. However, what I must add, and which is very, very important for me from my vantage point of being a woman, I think we must add the necessity of taking up the care recipients as important. It's never, we always think that the way we care, we can do it in every possible way. But I think a disabled person, a disabled woman, and a man also actually would want to say that this is the way I want the care, so care should be given, and he's mentioned care work, which I thought was very, very close to my heart, because my entire work, I think my next book is also on care work. And from there, I think I pick up the notion of what I call it as interdependence, which comes from the critical disability studies. Because I feel that, we think that we can, stay, without each other, but that's not possible. We all stay with each other, I mean, even if I need the PowerPoint, it's someone who is doing technology who is kind of doing it, so in that particular sense, I think it is very, very important that the notion of interdependence is understood, and is understood in such a way where we say that, of course, there can be problems which are there, but still, we have to stay with each other, and we can kind of, I mean, I often take this particular example where I say that, a woman who's looking after the daughter is also giving something to the mother. So this is the kind of interdependence which is there, and we must always, acknowledge that. Here, I would like to pick up an example which is not there in the slide, because I thought that I would kind of, do that as they come to my mind. And this is like, for example, in, there are many, many women who actually reach the advocates and say that they want to get a hysterectomy done. They want to get a hysterectomy done because the support system is not there. So when they take care, abuse can happen, and disabled daughters can become disabled women also, we can say, can become pregnant. So in one particular sense, they are saying that abortion is the only way, and yet we are legitimizing that part, because the women cannot really support, both the women, and if they reach that level where they have, they become pregnant, then, it becomes even more difficult. So I think interdependence becomes very, very important from that point of view. Now I go on, and I mean, when we say that the word community in itself is very, very important. Also, of course, we all say that we are in a community, but from what I gather, and I'm sure, I mean, there would be questions when we finish, but I think community in India, and specifically I would say in South Asia, communities are often faction ridden, with undercurrents of suspicion, mistrust, and personal rivalries, Now, there is culture of dependency, has been initiatives to mobilize local resources, and these are often viewed with skepticism and disability. Now, programs such as CBR are highly vulnerable to local influences. So, for example, I mean, I have one distinctive example that I want to share with you. At the time of, a Gujarat earthquake, as food packets were being sent. So the food packets were being sent to the one particular part, which is the upper caste, So if they were to reach via helicopters, if the food packets were reaching the upper caste, they would never pick them up, because they can never go and give it to the lower caste people. So in that particular sense, caste becomes a very, very significant variable. And in that particular sense, disabled do not, or disability is not a homogeneity. Actually, there is so much of heterogeneity in the communities that there could be, Muslims, there could be, Dalits, which means that the lower caste people, there could be disabled people, and within disabled, in our legislation, I'm not sure about the American legislation, we've got almost 21 disabilities that are there. So there is so much of heterogeneity out there that we can't imagine that whether within community, all workers are used to and they can kind of be trained in every possible disability, which is out of question. It is not done. So I feel that they are clearly stratified in terms of nature and severity of impairment, and disability, gender, class, caste, race, religion, and locational context are very, very important, and which we must always be very, very concerned about the fact that it is somewhere very, very critical that we look at it from critical disability studies point of view, where we look at disability as both a lived reality in which the experiences of people with disabilities are central to interpreting their place in the world, and as social and political definition based on societal power relations. I think CBR is celebrated throughout the world, I think, because we can't say that we can do this without CBR. But when we say that it's celebrated, but there are spaces for reflection, for questioning, especially I would say by the local people working within it, and it remain, as it seems, very few. One may speculate that this may be because of the fear of compromising funding or of challenging established discourse. But if it may also be because many of those engaged in CBR practice may find little time or opportunity for such reflective exercises. There are strong, informational bottlenecks. That is, that literature that is produced, for example, in the regions such as global north or global north and vice versa. And we need to kind of, find out whether there is enough information out there that can actually train the community workers and how they can kind of, address these kind of disabilities that are there. The next part, which is very, very important for me, is the NGOization. Now I think the causes of this enduring dependence on NGOs are numerous. All over. I think whether in global south or in global north, NGOs become very, very important because many a times there is an abdication of the responsibility by the state, by the government in that sense, and they may stem from a reluctance for NGOs to fund local agencies or grassroots initiatives. They may also stem from the creation of a culture of dependence, or possibly from the imposition of a foreign model that is simply not sustainable without significance and ongoing NGO assistance. Alternatively, it may stem from local governments not seeing people with disabilities as priority. Regardless of the cause and the consequence of being predominantly implemented by NGOs is the fact that CBR has nearly always been implemented in the form of specific projects, which means that there is not a lifelong kind of a development which is made towards people with disabilities. So what they do is that these become almost CBR initiatives, and CBR has nearly always been implemented in the form of specific projects, and somewhere the initiatives are typically micro level activities in discrete areas such as rural area, a slum, or a district. Further, such projects are almost always time limited, and the identity and the reality of CBR in the form of micro level time-limited projects run contrary to the needs of people with disabilities in countries of the global south, and especially, the rural and the urban area, and also the slums where, we are thinking of people with disabilities, and these issues become very, very important for us. One important change has been the widening of the scope from the rehabilitation skills to a holistic view and thinking of education, livelihood, DPOs, legal rights, etc. There are many. This had led to a change in the name of community-based inclusive development, or like what Heather said, the international inclusive, rehabilitation. So CBID, through a lot of persons still prefer to call it CBR in India. Of course, in Queens, of course, there's a different terminology that we use. Another important change is that from smaller NGO-led projects in many countries, CBR is the national rehab policy. This means that CBR is a part of national program, so it is covering a lot more people. At the same time, it is just another of government's program, so it is more bureaucratic and less people centered. So it means that we really can't give that much of scope where people with disabilities themselves can fight out for what their resistance is and how they can manage to fight for themselves and say that they are as any citizen in this country, they also are citizens of this particular country. Another huge change is that today there are many more DPOs in developing countries, so that the fight for rights and advocacy occur at other levels that are not with CBR. For example, technology changes, mobile phones, YouTube have all an impact on today's context. For example, earlier people in the village had no information. They needed a CBR worker to come and talk to them. Today, parents can find YouTube videos or other parents and link with them through social media. And there is a little or no research on the CBR in this changing context. A lot of persons who were active in CBR continue to think of it in the same old ways, which I think has to change, because as we change with technology, the fact that I'm here talking to you, that in itself, I think is an indication of the fact that CBR workers need to be trained, and trained in a different way, where I think technology becomes very, very important for them, and also the training of technology also becomes very, very important. I'm also really concerned about the theoretical framework on, the robust academic analysis. For example, Mandya indicates that the clear, elucidation of a leadership structure and a training framework for CBR is not there. The current reality is that the global CBR movement has not grown corresponding with the number of people in the global, South who require the services, empowerment, livelihood, and social inclusion that it should facilitate. And that is the reason why we should actually think about, how the knowledge construction in community-based rehabilitation becomes very, very important. When I say that epistemology is very important, we never think about how we can think about the epistemology of the community-based rehabilitation. And if we have that, then I think knowledge changes from one particular area or one particular community to another community. In Delhi, for example, there would be almost so many slum areas, and also regions where, they have people with disabilities and they are looking after them. But it depends whether we can kind of, relate to each other in a way where we can say that somewhere how many people who require, services, and not only services, but also, they have to understand their own identity, and whether we can, as disabled people, we can become as human as anyone would be, I think. And that is very, very important. As these CBR guidelines highlight, much more is known about disability today. As over the past 30 years, CBR has undergone a significant evolutionary process. CBR is a strategy for community-based inclusive development, which takes into account the principles of Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. For example, non-discrimination and the need to include all people with disciplines in development initiatives. Therefore, it is important that CBR programs take steps to address issues which they have traditionally excluded, such as, for example, mental health problems, or HIV, or AIDS, or leprosy, and humanitarian crisis. CBR programs are also encouraged to think broadly about other issues such as CBR and children, CBR and aging, that are particularly relevant in their communities, and which may be included in future deliberations. The most important thing which I want to kind of talk about in Mandya, which we did, is about emancipatory research. And emancipatory research comes from the critical disability theory, because we feel that, the disabling parts which are there, and how we can, research that can be there only for the subjects, which it means that research is there for, the academicians, the ones who are, obviously getting their, degrees, and which they should. But the point is that when we do research, is that research actually also creating emancipation for people with disabilities? Whatever we do, is it helpful for them? We need to ask this particular question, that while I'm researching, am I reflexive enough to know that what is it that I have given to the person with disability? And if I have not given anything to person with disability, then what is the big idea of actually doing research and emancipatory research, which can then be part and parcel of community-based rehabilitation? I want to bring in two important concepts, and that is, one is the concept of gaze. When I think about gaze, I think for both men and women, I mean, the gaze is always, the gaze of the able-bodied, society. And able-bodied society always look at you, and they feel as if, you need to be looked at. And more so in India, I mean, in South Asia, I think there's another way where, when you are on a wheelchair, or where you are a visually impaired person with a cane, you talk about the stare, and the way they stare at you, that in itself, I think, becomes very, very problematic. And this creates a lot of othering, and othering means that we become, Fiona said, that we actually, difference is very, very important. And Dr. Peat, of course, said that difference is there when we can understand the difference. But the othering part, where we think that there are people, who are completely different from the able-bodied society. And I feel that becomes the important part of research, and the emancipation in that particular sense is very important if it were to relate to the community-based rehabilitation. And I feel that this is very, very important, that, we I remember as a young, BA student, and this is an example that is a part and parcel of my life, where I said that nobody ever whistled at me. When I said nobody ever whistled at me, now as a teacher, I would also say, I would, cry blue murder, that how can you kind of, do eve teasing for my students. But about me, I thought about it, and I said that because it seemed as if I'm completely, they thought about me as a woman who is completely desexualized, and in that particular sense, I think that becomes one of the absence which I find in community-based rehabilitation. Of course, it might be there in global north, but I think the absences that I find are about embodiment, about reproductive health, and about sexuality. And I think one particular example about sexuality, I would kind of, try to help you with, where I said that, in predominant North Indian, part, the cousins are allowed to, men and women, I mean, boys and girls are allowed to stay with each other, but they are not allowed to sleep in the same room. And many of the fellow disabled, and specifically women, who actually felt very happy that now they are allowed to sleep in the boys' room, and the other girls who are able-bodied are not being allowed. But it was only later, when once, went over it and interpreted it from the critical disability approach, one understood that they were actually once again desexualizing. And not only desexualizing, they were also, instrumental in creating more abuse, sexual abuse, which could happen in the family itself. And I'm not sure about, Canada and America, but about the global north, but about India, I mean, the most of the rapes that happen, they happen in the familial situations, where there is either an uncle or, and molestation at times is done of the, father also. And in that particular sense, I think that becomes a very important part of CBR. But CBR, by and large, tries to address the issues which are the basic issues. And the basic issues are education, livelihood, the looking after, and health, these concerns. But they don't reach that point where they can think about sexuality, because I think disability movement also within itself always kind of, misses out on that, and says that because either disabled people are hypersexual or they are asexual. So in that particular sense, I find that CBR should address its corpus, and if it addresses its corpus, then there would be a reason where they would be able to understand sexuality in a more, kind of feasible way, where they can say that they can be sexual, but how we can educate them sexually, and how we can say that, the understanding within India. Of course, the cultural context is that there's either arranged marriage, and of course now there are chances where, lived-in relationships, or there are, love marriages do happen. But for disabled women, it so happens that they have to, they can't, I mean, arranged marriages don't happen, because, the very indication that you are disabled. So because you are disabled, you have a flaw, you have a lack, so the othering part, which I said earlier, again comes up. And in that sense, I think sexuality has to be understood in CBR, and in one particular sense should become a part of how the community also understands, and how community can get together with each other, and the patterns can be created, so that it should not be always people who come from outside and who come and help you out, but it should be people within that same community where they live. If they can be trained, in the ways. Do I have more time, or?
Maybe about 5 minutes, and then
Yeah, okay,
because we definitely want a chance for questions.
Okay. So, and then I would take up something like prenatal selection as one example, where I would say that, many people who would kind of simply say that, because India specifically, sex selection is important. So the amniocentesis test becomes a, problematic test, because it can also test the abnormality, and it can also test the sex of the child. But it so happens that, because sons are more important and daughters are not so important, so what they do is that it now has a ban. So you can only use the test if it is like, a doctor with the permission, and if it is understood that the test is being used for sex selection, they can be caught, and it is very, very punitive. But on the same legislation, they would allow that you can get abortions if you actually see that a fetus is a disabled fetus. When such things happen, once again, I can't find, a reason. Even the Bangalore, researchers, I mean, I would be sending 4 papers which are there of Bangalore, where, this work has been done. And if we were to look at that, we realize that somewhere they are again saying that, to be for a disabled person, burden is the element that is used. And they kind of say that, one, I am disabled, and another, no, one, I'm a woman, and second, I'm also disabled, or a man also who is disabled. So both disabled men and disabled women are to be thought of, and also think about the possibility of the prenatal selection, that whether it should be there, or whether selection should be thought of, and where do we draw a line. Because we think about a lot of human genome researches and all, where we think about that we can somewhere find out, we want designer babies. And when we want designer babies, then how do we think about children with disabilities, adolescents with disabilities, adults with disabilities? And at that particular point, I think the corpus of CPR needs to be enhanced even more. I remember Dr. Peat's quote, with which I will end, where he says, begin with what they have, build on what they know. But of the best leaders, when their task is accomplished, their work is done, the people all remark, we have done it ourselves. So that is that if we actually can be together with each other, and if actually we reach a particular position, which Dr. Peat says, and the last, where Fiona said that, but of course I'm going to kind of read this, where we say that if you can make a difference, why wouldn't you? It was the philosophy that was all his work. If he could be a catalyst in making a difference for those who couldn't, then that was a good thing. So I think the idea that we can work, and I feel that the epistemology, the knowledge construction of community-based rehabilitation must always be thought about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ghai, for that really enlightening lecture. And I think it's so important to turn a critical disability studies lens to the work that we do in community-based rehabilitation. And you've highlighted some really important gaps that I think our community definitely needs to consider. I'm going to turn it over to questions because they are starting to come in fast and furious. So we'll see how many we
Yeah.
can get through. The first question comes from Abebe Alemu. And he says, we know that technology has brought tremendous benefits, both to people with and without disabilities, but I feel sometimes that technology has also negatively affected and even exacerbated the life of people with disabilities. How do you see it in relation to the concept of universal design?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I feel that, of course, technology is very helpful, but when we do technology to the extent, for example, if we take the example of bionics, if we take one particular example where we are trying to keep on normalizing along with technology, that means that once again we will go back to the able-bodied society. We'll say that, of course, technology is there, and do as much technology as you can so that you can create only the so-called normal persons. Now, our task is not that. Our task is that we should actually respect, like, for example, if I want to use the wheelchair, I should be allowed to use the wheelchair. It shouldn't be that I should have the bionic legs and then I should be able to walk without them. So I think if that kind of technology is there, then I think it becomes dangerous. Gregor Wahlbring's work, I think, is wonderful work where, he talks about how the ableism and how technology and ableism are related to each other. I think that's a very good paper that one should actually take it up. And also I feel that, universal design should be there, because I think it's not only the disabled people who gain from new technology. For example, if you have an elevator, the elevator is used by the aged people also, and disability in that particular sense can happen to anyone at any particular point in time. When I think about India, you can think about and global north also and south also. For example, it's not only heredity that is important. It is also landmines, it's pellets in India. Kashmir is one example. The bomb blasts, the natural disasters and the man-made disasters, or the women-made disasters, whatever they are. All these are there. So I feel that universal design is important, because then we can create, at least the hegemony of normality should be erased in one particular sense. I hope I've given the yeah.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Teresa Lorenzo, and she says, the notion of gaze is critical, as there needs to be a shift from the individual with an impairment to the family as a whole. How do we shift training of health and rehab professionals to recognize community rehab workers as practitioners, especially training disabled people as inclusive development practitioners?
Yeah, I think that's very, very important. But I feel that if we don't, it's important, and I brought in the gaze part, because I feel that if the theoretical work is not done along with, the practice, engaged practice. So I think both theory as well as engaged practice, and then of course, learning that what this gaze and the stare can be there. And I think if if it happens like that, then I think we can learn. But I think for that, it is first important to ask ourselves, our own subjectivity, that what is the internalized oppression that is within me, and how I can, as a worker, as a community worker, what are my issues, which I can erase. So I think if you look at the gaze, the able-bodied gaze, and gaze is not only from the man, the gaze can come from women also, no, because the able-bodied women also would look at you in that particular sense. So I think the precariousness that is there, that must be taught, and trained to the people who are. And somewhere I feel that the training programs must always have the knowledge construction of, how embodiment, how, the gaze comes in, and the embodied person feels that, look, I am as human as anyone, and this particular gaze, I can look back and I can kind of, answer back. I think that would be very, very important in that sense.
Thank you. The next question is from Navjeet Gaurav. He says, thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. How do you envision the future of CBR without NGO-induced dependency on the community in Indian or low-resource contexts?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. Yes, of course. I will, like, it's one way to say it, but also to realize it. See, because whenever the NGOs are there, from my understanding, I might be wrong, but many times the agenda of the NGOs is always their agenda. I think NGOs which actually manage to, transform the agenda to the people, then I think there is no harm in having NGOs out there, right? But if it is only with a particular agenda that they have come, then I think you need to, question. And I think CBR did one very good thing, at least in India. I'm not sure about Canada, but and that was of creating self-help groups, So if we can create self-help groups, then I think there would be reason why not so much of NGOs are not, needed. But still, it's a kind of a necessary evil, where you will have to be there, and funding is required. So I think I would say that my answer would be, I'm also one of the, academicians who always says that not all questions have answers, because some answers we have to trace, and we've got to think about our, phenomenology that is there, and how we can kind of, think about, the possibility of the NGOs helping us and how they can address the concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question from Andy Wang. He says, my vision of community-based rehabilitation is also to train people with disabilities to be rehab therapists. How do we encourage people with disabilities to apply and get accepted into schools of rehabilitation therapy all over the world?
Yeah, I think many, in fact, it's not as if, this is the only way. Like I said, no, for us, it becomes a national program of rehabilitation, so there are many people who go and take it, because there is, and also because if you look at the employment, many at times the jobs are not, very difficult to get, so they take whatever they get. So many at times, you have people who actually are not interested in rehabilitation, but because they have no option, so they take it. But I think that somewhere, to improve the quality of life of rehabilitation, I think that is something which is very important. And also something which is very important when I kind of think about my curriculum, and if I've seen it in 2020, in 2021 I must have a reflection that, is it worth, have I changed something, have I thought about it? And if I haven't thought about it, then there is a reason for me to kind of change whatever. So I feel that if such programs are there, where the persons with disabilities want to improve their own lives, and they also become a part of the same community in which they stay, then I think all the more reason that the training should be there, and they should be included in these kind of jobs.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ghai. This is actually the end of the time that we'll have available for the Peat Lecture. I know that some questions didn't get answered, and I know maybe Professor Ghai. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead, so where we should start to make CBR a national program in a given country? How to elevate micro level? Oh my God, there are many questions. How? Okay. No, but let me just answer. Well, I suppose in any given country. I mean, I've seen that happening in South Africa. I've seen that happening in, uh, uh, I'm just missing Bangladesh, and then Nepal, so many of the countries where it is happening. I think you can bring in. If nothing is happening, then at least the CBR should come, no? Because at least some help, some assistance is there, in that particular sense. But of course, if we reframe it, many a times we can also actually realize what I would call it for CBR. I actually say that it is almost like engaged practice, and once we have done an engaged practice, so the internships and all have been done, then I think there is a reason why it should always be there in every country. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ghai. And it's always the sign of a great lecture when we're leaving with more questions and more people wanting to talk than we actually have time for. I know Professor Ghai was willing to share her email address, and anyone can follow up with her directly. And we will also send the slides that we were unable to share today along to participants as well.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry about that. I mean, I think they were ready.
It's technology. It worked when we tried it out early. Thank you so much, Professor Ghai, for an engaging talk. And to the audience for joining us today. I'd like to thank once again the family and friends of Dr. Malcolm Peat and the donors of the Malcolm Peat Lecture Fund. I'd also like to thank David, Nancy, Chantel, Carol, and the rest of the amazing team for organizing this event and making sure that it ran smoothly today.
Nancy, and a special thank you to Fiona for sharing.
Of course, a special thank you to Fiona. And Nancy will be providing, she has provided the link in the chat for anyone who would like to donate to the fund so that we might continue to hold these wonderful lectures in the years to come. And as a final note, once this event ends, all the attendees will get a pop-up with a short survey for feedback on the event. And I would love that it's an opportunity for you to identify potential future speakers that we might invite for the Malcolm Peat Lectureship. So we'd love to get your thoughts on who else could join us in future years. And you'll also receive a follow-up email that will provide the link to the recording of the lecture today.
Thank you so much.
So
and thank you everyone, please.
Yes, thank you to everyone. And depending on where you are in the world, I hope you have a great day or a lovely evening.